the way that we view talent at Deeper Signals, and really what the consensus is over the last 30 years of scientific research, is that talent is really personality in the right place. So if we understand our personality to be the way that we all think, feel, make decisions, interact with others, these kind of stable attributes about ourselves that impact the way that we relate with others, impact the way that we work. And the way that that personality helps us become talented is if we are surrounded by the right colleagues, the right environment, the right culture that matches our dispositions. And so the big thing that we're really trying to do in the world of talent management, talent selection, development, is really identify, what people have the right skills, tendencies, and abilities, and put them in the right places, the right teams that are going to best fit them. And this is kind of where we see a lot of the problems within an organization start to happen, is that leaders don't necessarily understand their people. They don't have the tools, the insights, the data to really measure those dispositions. And so people are hired into roles that don't necessarily suit them, or they get promoted into positions that are that overextend their ability or are not aligned with the ways that they typically like to behave, think, and make decisions. And so we can think about the science of talent and the purpose of talent analytics is to really solve that equation, right? Who has what qualities? What is the environmental demands, and how can we bridge that gap, put the right people in the right place? And if we do that, we're more likely to see organizations thrive and succeed. There's tons of research showing that these different attributes are predictive of things like leadership success, job performance, and so on. And when we get that environment piece right, when we get the right people in the right place, we see an accelerated path to performance. Thinking about how to select people in a methodical, data-driven, evidence-based way is tiring, right? They've got enough things to worry about, and so they, of course, are going to rely on more intuitive and heuristic type thinking, which is completely natural. That's kind of how humans have evolved. I don't think necessarily we should, all bias is just mental shortcuts, and of course, those biases can really lead to prejudice and discrimination. But there's a variety of other biases that kind of shape our thinking. And the key thing is to identify, where that bias is creeping in to your selection practices, and then trying to counter it with more objective measurements and objective tools. Whether that's kind of just standardizing processes and having, good rubrics to evaluate people in interviews, that would go a long way when it comes to hiring and developing in a more equitable fashion. But then, of course, using more data-driven tools like, say, psychometric assessments, 360s, SJTs, those kind of things, where you're able to reliably measure someone's soft skills and in many ways cognitive abilities too, which are then going to be measured irrespective of what the hiring manager kind of has to think. It's very hard to argue with numbers. And so I think, just to zoom back out and summarize what I've said, I think the way that you can counter bias in your selection practices is, one, talk about and understand your own bias and kind of how that creeps in. Two, try to standardize more of your hiring processes and invest in training your managers up so they know what to look for and how to evaluate it. And then three, invest much more in objective assessment tools that can give you data that is outside of human judgment. So a good working definition of talent analytics is really it's the analysis of employee data using statistical techniques and technology to really improve your decision-making as a leader and as a manager. So it's about using data to understand the employee life cycle. So what drives performance, how long do people stay in a certain role, how many people are promoted, who does the promoting, all these kind of things, like what demographics are you promoting and moving into different roles and so on. And then taking all that data, using a variety of different statistical techniques to not only understand, so describe what's happening in your organization, but to also start to forecast around what is likely to happen in the future. Because if you can predict what's going to happen in the future, you can then start to make corrective measures to avoid some of the bad things, So if you know that your top performers are more likely to leave because of ABC reasons, because you've done the analysis, then you can invest in your retention programs. Vice versa, if you know certain attributes are more likely to perform in certain roles, you should double down and improve your selection practices and development practices to boost those qualities too. So it's really trying to get ahead of problems before they become a thorn in your side and ultimately derail your business strategies. So it's really, again, just applying data to people decisions and workforce planning. The success of talent analytics and kind of the AI and using data and all these kind of cool things really requires you to have a good talent management practice already in place. So again, how are you doing performance reviews? How are you doing exit interviews? How are you doing hiring interviews? All these kind of things are really, really critical, because the only way that talent analytics really works is if you have good, reliable data. So if you are evaluating people, or if you're giving people or hiring people based on no kind of standardized rubric, and your performance appraisals are based on just intuition, and you get rid of performance ratings, then we don't necessarily have the data to identify who is a good performer, who is a poor fit, who is a good fit, and so on. And so the very first thing you need to do is get good practices that enable you to collect good data. And good data, I mean standardized data. So everyone kind of gets assessed against the same types of rubrics. There is a clear understanding as to kind of how that data was gathered, what that data represents, and ultimately how that data is stored. I see it so many times now where I work with organizations that don't do any of this. They come to us and they're like, Reece, can you tell us who our high performers are? Okay, sure thing. So where's your performance metrics? Oh, we don't have any. Or at worst, it's literally like a spreadsheet with just a list of names, and they may have like a tick or a cross next to people's names as to identify them as whether they're top or bottom performers, which just doesn't make sense. And so a big part of the work that we then have to do before we can even worry about the prediction side of things, like what actually drives performance, is actually just help them have a solid foundation around what performance is. And so again, aside from data, it means actually understanding and having a definition around what performance looks like within your organization. So again, it goes back to competencies and having a clear definition around what good looks like in your organization. Because if you have that defined, you can then start to build processes to collect the right data that is an indicator of those qualities. So once you've got all that done, the next thing is to ask the right questions. So the right questions are questions around problems that you're trying to solve within your organization as it pertains to your people strategy. And now those questions shouldn't be really broad, like what drives performance, because there's a multitude of factors that can be impacting and answering that question, and those things are likely to change on a seasonal basis. So it's about kind of forming more specific hypotheses around your people and their impact on kind of KPIs, and then starting to go out and source the right data you need to answer those questions. So for example, rather than saying, okay, what drives performance in my organization, it could be what drives performance in my marketing team. And then you go to your marketing team, you understand that environment, you understand what performance looks like, you build reliable outcome measures, and then you collect kind of demographic factors, you collect personality, you collect cognitivity, you collect values, you collect demographics, whatever it could be, and then start to build a statistical model that looks at the relationship between those predictors and the outcomes. If we don't get the outcomes right, you put the cart before the horse, and then you're not able to get your talent analytics strategy or function up and running, because you don't actually have a good solid representation or measurement of the outcome that you're most invested in. Once you've done all of that, it requires your HR team to become more data literate. So this is something that not only HR is needing to do, it's something that the world of work is needing to do, period, right? As we live in more tech-enabled worlds and environments, even more so now with work from home, and the fact that kind of technology touches really every aspect of our lives, the ability to understand and work with data, to tell stories around it, to understand it, to mine it, is critical. And so what I'm not calling for is every HR professional to become a statistics genius, but rather one, like build a basic foundation in, some foundational statistical concepts like, correlation, distributions, and things like that. And then also try to hire specifically for those roles in your HR team. Like hire a data scientist into your HR team so they can understand and work with all of this data. And then alongside that, you want to invest in your ability to tell good stories with data too. So the fourth part of a good talent analytics structure of function is the ability to manage stakeholders and tell good stories. And so one, that requires HR really understanding, the business needs and the problems that their various leaders are facing. Two, the ability to communicate those stories and actually really speak to what matters most. I see it time and time again where well-meaning talent analytics functions come up with these amazing models that predict all sorts of things, but they're so overly academic or they are so nuanced that they actually have no practical business value whatsoever. Again, the key point here with talent analytics is you're trying to use data to solve people problems to help the business advance. And then the very final thing is like how you deliver that information, how you tell that story really comes down to not only your communication skills, but also how you present that data. So data visualization is critical. How can you create interesting charts that bring your data to life, that really demonstrate, say, the impact and the ROI of different talent interventions or practices. So just to summarize that kind of long-winded answer is one, get good foundational practices in place. Two, ask the right questions. Three, become more data literate. And then four, really work on your ability to tell meaningful stories and manage stakeholders. What we call descriptive statistics. What we need to move to is much more inferential statistics. So as one thing goes up, does another thing go down, and so on, right? So what we want to look more at is kind of we want to look for correlations between different variables. So are certain, personality traits more likely or less likely to be a top performer or a lower performer? Do leaders have certain qualities over others, and so on? And so that's kind of like a very simple way of doing it. And ultimately that would give you a lot of influence and a lot of mileage in improving your talent analytics functions. The next step is to really go beyond into artificial intelligence or more practically machine learning, which is whereby despite its kind of ambiguous and kind of maybe somewhat scary name, all AI is doing is saying, computer, here is a bunch of predictors and here is the outcome. Tell me the best relationship or show me the pattern between these collection of variables. And so I can then take the algorithm, which is really just a bunch of rules and directions for how you weight and use different sources of inputs, different predictors, to give me the best prediction of that meaningful outcome. So for example, an algorithm is really just, say, a recipe. So turn the oven on at this temperature and then stir the food at this time or whatever it could be. And then all the algorithm is doing is taking the data, which you think of the food, to recombine it, to look at it, to chop it up, and then give you the finished product at the end. Now, algorithms are not foolproof. They do not guarantee certainty. That's another big thing we have to consider when it comes to talent analytics, is that it's not prophecy. And there's always going to be a degree of error in your statistics. There's a famous phrase that says, all statistics are bad, but some are more useful than others. And this is definitely true when it comes to talent analytics, in that the way that we can use analytics properly is understand, that degree of error. So understand that this is better than, just chance and our intuition, but also understand, what are the limitations there. And so that's why it goes back to what I was saying earlier, around it's really important that we collect, meaningful data at, the day-to-day level, like performance appraisals, interviews, and so on, because the better we get high quality data to go into those models, the less error that there will be in our prediction models. But then what we can then do is, once we have all that data nicely organized, we can use different tools to actually start going beyond the things you just described, but sure to be much more descriptive. And I can kind of walk through a bit of an example of what that looks like on our platform. So for those of you that don't know, myself and Tomasz Chamorro and Rio and Dave Winsborough, my co-founders, we created a company called Deeper Signals. And really what we're trying to do is democratize talent feedback and use more data to help organizations understand and develop their people. And so what you're seeing right now is our platform. And I'm just going to show you one example of how you can start to use talent analytics if you invest in collecting meaningful assessment data and meaningful outcome data. And so first off, I'm going to show you something like this. So what I'm most interested in this example is to identify within my, say, hiring pool, who would be a high potential, right? Who has the potential to be a high potential? And so what you're seeing on this screen is a variety of different visualizations of the personality attributes within my organization. What I've done before today's session was I did an analysis to identify my high potential. A competency survey on their direct reports. And then what I was able to do is look at those that score highest. And then I was able to add a segment to them and say, okay, these 11 people are high performers based on these reliable 360 ratings from my managers. And then uploaded that data onto my platform. And what I can see is some really interesting insights. Because what I can now see is the attributes just from a personality perspective. And of course, there are a variety of other variables we could be looking at. But what I can see from a personality perspective is that those that are high performers are very driven. So they're very ambitious, they're very competitive, they're very goal-orientated, they're very flexible. So they're very adaptive, very agile, and can keep up with change. And also they're very curious. So they like to innovate, they like to experiment, they like to do new things. So armed with those insights, with that profile, I can then start to work backwards and apply some objective criteria as to who my top performers, or who in my hiring pool has the potential to be a top performer, or in my succession pipeline, who has the potential. So I can then go back to this responses tab, and I can just add a bit of data to this table. So I said in that analysis, the most driven, curious, and flexible people are those that are high performers. And so with that information, I can then start to apply the objective criteria. So I can say, all right, I want to see everyone in my organization that is curious, driven, and then flexible. And I can set criteria here. So everyone that was above 50% on our measure of curiosity, above 50% on our drive scale, and then the same with flexibility too. I can then hit apply, and then I can see, okay, within my succession pipeline, I have these two people, Lacey and Ort, that are that have a similar profile as identified from my previous analysis looking at high potentials. I could then tag these people and then shortlist them for an interview or put them onto that high potential program or whatever it could be. The key thing here is that rather than just relying on my intuition as to kind of who is a high potential and who should I be promoting and investing development resources in, I actually had a more data-driven, inductive approach. I went out, I asked my managers who are the top performers, used a 360 survey to collect reliable competency data. I then segmented the audience to see, okay, who in my organization is a top performer, what are their profiles. I then went back to then apply those criteria and look at who else in my organization has a similar profile, with the assumption being that those that have those qualities are more likely to become a top performer and really thrive within my organization. The alternative would be, how do I wake up today? Who do I think is good? And then just make a decision based on my intuition and kind of who maybe spoke to me last and a variety of other biases. Once I've kind of done that, I can then do all sorts of things. So say, for example, I want to promote, say, Lacey or into a certain team. I can then start to explore what that team would look like. So if I go back to my high potentials, I can see the variety of different qualities that they have, and I can obviously interpret this data to think about, the certain goals that this team may have, or what they need to achieve in an organization. I can look at kind of how maybe they work together. I can also compare individuals. The idea being here, you want to be able to understand kind of who you're hiring and who you're promoting, using objective measures, seeing how they would work together before you actually make that decision that could maybe be biased and harmful to other people, to certain protected groups, or just be harmful to your business because you're just hiring the wrong people. So for example, let's say I'm going to build this team here. I want to see how well is this person or going to work and fit within this team here. Let's say they're going to be their marketing team. I can say, okay, well, this person is going to add, much more drive to the team. They're going to be much more emotionally stable, so that help them be more resilient, more outgoing, so they'll be more relationship focused, and so on. And again, you can interpret these data based on the objectives and mission of the team that you may be selecting someone into, and then start to get ahead of some problems. Because if I was a manager, I could see this data, I can then start to adapt my style, start to onboard people better, coach my team differently, and so on. This is just a very short kind of example. So I think you're right to be skeptical about the term artificial intelligence, because the technology is great, it has a ton of potential, but there is a ton of charlatans and bullshit artists kind of in our space right now saying that you can use AI to kind of solve all manner of problems. And that's really kind of stretching the truth. AI, its simplest, is just a tech-enabled way of mining patterns between two sources of data, predictors and outcomes. And then the idea being it can identify patterns that are so complicated that humans can't, process it, or it takes a long time to do. And then the machine can tell us, okay, with a certain degree of accuracy, people that have XYZ attributes or behaviors or whatever are more likely or less likely to do something in the future. And so AI is just a way of kind of speeding up that kind of deductive process that we all have. And it's great because you can use data to fight bias and detect bias, because you could use AI to kind of say, okay, who is my company currently promoting? And then you will see everyone that is being promoted is like a white male that is under a certain age. And of course, that's not necessarily representative of your population, or you may be discriminating against protected groups and so on. It can also identify other markers of performance. So a big piece of research that's been happening over the last few years is using novel sources of data. So things like our social media footprints, our text that we use in online communications, our digital footprints. And AI is able to take all of that data and then show how it predicts meaningful outcomes. Of course, we saw this, being played out in in one of the most kind of deviant ways with Cambridge Analytica back in the UK and here in the US around kind of voting preferences. But it's a similar kind of idea. Like, how can we take all the data that we now amass, organize it, mine it, and then make forecasts around how someone may behave? Now, when it comes to implementing AI in an organization and using in HR applications, there's a ton of opportunity, but again, it goes back to really getting the right data first, having the right questions, because AI can be very much like that phrase, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. AI can definitely apply to that, right? You can have very sophisticated technologies trying to solve very simple problems. If you just took, a couple of days to collect the right data and then just run a very simple correlation, that wouldn't require like a huge investment of time and energy. And so this goes back to what I was saying with how to stand up a good talent analytics function is becoming more data literate. Because if you become data literate, you're able to kind of ask the right questions to, say, vendors selling AI-driven tools. And also, you kind of identify there's cheaper, faster ways of doing it. And if you hire for those people into your HR team, they'll definitely have the skill sets and the intelligence and smarts to know what requires a machine learning driven approach versus, just a normal kind of statistics approach, which is collect data and look at those kind of correlations. The key thing to remember, though, with AI algorithms is that they are incredibly powerful. You can do a lot of cool things. but you have to make sure that you are using them responsibly. And so because this is, a lot of AI algorithms are kind of self-adapting. The more data you feed it, it trains itself and it tries to improve on its performance. So it tries to become more accurate. It can quickly become what Kathy O'Neill calls a weapon of math destruction. And that this algorithm can become really scaled, so it applies to a lot of people. It can be very opaque, so no one knows exactly how it's working. And then it starts to really impact, people's lives because, hiring and development decisions are based on it. And of course, if you have an algorithm that is kind of saying this person is marked as a low performer, well, of course, humans' intuition and bias is going to look at that and think, okay, well, I'm just going to kind of, let that person go. And that could be completely biased. Algorithms are only as good as people that make them. And so an algorithm is not your solution to a problem, but rather good data, good questions, and kind of really thinking through the consequences and the applications of what problem you're trying to solve with data will then get you an algorithm that is responsible, ethical, and ultimately does what it needs to do. And so a thing you need to do when you're developing or using algorithms in your organization is always push for transparency. So what data is it using? How is it weighting it? And what is it trying to predict? 2, conduct regular audits. So make sure you're frequently testing not only the accuracy, does it predict the thing that you're trying to predict as it gets new data, but also is it impacting in an adverse way protected groups? So is it biasing against minorities, against genders, age groups, and so on? Your algorithm at time 1 may meet all those criteria and it looks great, but then 6 months later, when it's had even more data to adapt itself on, those biases can kind of creep in. And so it really requires you to stay on top of it. And then the final things really is reliability and validity, like these kind of 2 concepts that are very traditional in the psychometrics world, which is if the algorithm measures you, at one point in time, is it likely to give you a similar prediction, at another point in time? And if it's wildly different, without there being a clear rationale for it, then how much can you really trust the algorithm? And then finally, validity is really like, the accuracy. Does it actually predict the thing it's meant to predict? And so what we're seeing a lot more now in organizations that have implemented AI is that they're increasingly, embedding these practices into their kind of HR teams. So conducting those audits, making sure that they are able to identify, how the algorithm is working, and use relevant benchmarks to evaluate its quality. And I think that's really important because people will feel uncomfortable if an algorithm is kind of processing them if they don't understand how it works. And so a big part of introducing talent analytics into your organization is really transparency from a cultural perspective. I think HR departments owe it to their employees to kind of say, this is the data we're collecting, this is how we're using it, this is how it's being processed, and this is how it shapes the way that we interact with people through that life cycle. Because it becomes a very kind of creepy and it can become like a surveillance tool if not managed correctly. And the last thing you want to do is completely alienate your employees that you're there really to trying to help. And another big thing I think is a big mind shift is that just HR technology in general and HR in general needs to switch its mindset from viewing employees as something that we need to do something to. So we need to assess these people, or we need to kind of get these people through these programs or whatever it could be, and actually starting to have a much more bi-directional relationship. How can HR help employees grow and thrive? How can we bring them along the journey? How can we design practices and processes that suit them? And so this really comes back to technology as well. How can we use data and technology that is designed for the end user in mind, rather than just a formality or some organizational process that we just need to work through? And so again, you can think about talent analytics in the far future, and maybe not actually so far in the far future now, we should be doing this, is to actually democratize that data. So if my employer has a bunch of insights on me and how I perform and what I enjoy, what I find most engaging and so on, I should know what those things are. I should understand what data my company has on me. And so I can use that, so I can better myself. It's kind of like a one-sided relationship otherwise. They know everything about you and you may not know what they know about you. And so I think the more we can make that fair and equitable, the more data we can use and bring into conversations, because there is a contract there. right? It's like a social contract about how we want to work with each other, how we want to use data in our organization as an employee, as a manager, as a leader.
What recommendations can you give us to improve that dark side of HR?
You know, there is a ton of free resources now online. There's online courses from companies like Udacity and Coursera that offer, you know, very simple and very engaging introductions to statistics, machine learning, data visualization, and talent analytics. That's a great way to kind of, you know, self-direct your own learning, and these things can be done in your own time. And of course, organizations are increasingly investing in kind of training programs for their employees to learn these things as well. So if you are a HR leader that has that kind of that ability to make those kind of decisions, that would be my recommendation, is to get your team trained up. Other things you can do are really looking at you know, talent analytics meetups and communities within your local cities. So there's a vibrant community now of, you know, practitioners that meet regularly and, you know, share learnings, share tools. I think this is still a very new space, and we know HR moves quite slowly, and so there's a lot of opportunity to learn from each other. And ultimately, a lot of the things that are kind of classed as talent analytics are things that, you know, IO psychologists have known for a very, very long time, and are just being kind of rebranded and actually kind of made sexy for kind of the modern organization. And so, you know, it's going back to maybe some of the old findings around kind of what drives performance, how to detect bias, these kind of techniques and methodologies, and start to bring them, you know, into your organization. So online courses, they're abundant, meetups, trying to, you know, build a center of excellence within your organization, I think can really go a long way too. So if you say within your team, and I've seen this work really nicely, is, okay, me and my colleagues, we're all new to talent analytics. Let's kind of build a project. Let's try to answer a single question, and you kind of brute force it in many ways. It's like, okay, because you learn the process. Like, okay, to answer this question, okay, why are people leaving my team or this team? Okay, you have to go and collect data. You have to then organize that data. You have to, you know, start to clean it up. You have to analyze it. You have to learn how to visualize it. And I think, you know, ultimately there isn't like an easy way to do it other than, you know, really throw yourself in and embrace it and try to answer, you know, an interesting question. I think if you lead with curiosity, you'll be surprised at kind of how far it can take you. Other things, you know, that are really helpful is a company called My HR Future. It's a friend of mine has this company, and basically it's like an online subscription for a variety of different kind of HR programs beyond data analysis, but also to all sorts of things like running performance appraisals and so on. And I highly recommend you check it out. I don't get a commission, so, but it's just generally like a very, very good product. And it really kind of has a ton of industry experts, you know, talking about all of the things I mentioned today, plus more. So I really, really recommend that tool. So the first is really around more democratization of talent data. So there is a clear sense of ownership, understanding, and transparency around, you know, what my organization is measuring in me, and how can I use that data to help myself. Organizations should be there to help, not just kind of profile and analyze. I think that then leads to a more continuous cycle of feedback. So once I'm in an organization, how can I use this data to personalize my own development journeys and career pathways? So the more my organization knows about me, I should be able to use that data to direct my career. And of course, that data should then also be you know, able to be taken with me as I move into other organizations. So the idea of having a bit of a talent passport, as it were. So as I apply for jobs and as I move in and out of organizations, I can take all of this data to really tune and direct my career. And the final thing, which is using more novel sources of data. And what I mean by that is, are there things that we can use above and beyond the interview and the resume that would be more fairer, more transparent, and, you know, more objective when it comes to making, you know, hiring and selection decisions around. Because we know those things can be gained. We know there is a ton of bias. So for example, there's plenty of studies where if you have a non-white sounding name, you are automatically dinged and kind of like evaluated less than white sounding names. All these kind of biases still creep through. And we know they're pretty poor predictors of performance, yet we still use them. So how can we bring in other forms of analyses and other sources of data? In terms of then kind of golden rules or kind of key takeaways, so just to kind of sum up then the things I've discussed, I think the very, very first thing that I want you to all take away is the fact that we need to rely more on data and science over intuition and confidence. This goes back to what I said at the start. There's thousands of studies to show psychological attributes, when put in the right environment, are very predictive of performance and kind of effectiveness. And ultimately, human raters are pretty poor at evaluating others. So the first thing is we need to change that mindset, be more data focused. The second is really invest in your standard or foundational HR practices. So are you collecting data in a standardized way, in a consistent way across that entire life cycle? The more data you have about your people in a descriptive sense, the more you can do with it when it comes to building algorithms. The third is becoming more data literate. So either invest in your own skills, invest in your team skills, and hire in for people that can work with data, that can mine it, that can tell interesting stories, and most importantly, manage those stakeholders as well, because you're here as talent analytics practitioners to serve the business, not just create kind of cool charts for yourselves. And the very final one, the most important one, is as you move towards more data-driven practices, is you have to practice, algorithmic responsibility. So test your models, identify whether there's bias in that data, because data can be biased too, it often is, and make sure that these algorithms, are still valid, reliable, consistent, and treat each other equitably, because that's the whole purpose of this. It's about replacing that bias and that intuition with something that we can trust and rely on.
Thank you very much, Reece.
See you later. Bye-bye. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye, you too.